waiting for it to happen. Hello.
Hey, Jess.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to our 19th NiCHE conversation of this year, academic year, I should say. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I'm joined by Jonathan Luedee. Do you want to tell us more about yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Jess, for inviting me to speak today about Northern Borders and our ongoing series that's being hosted and published through the NiCHE site. So my name is John Luedee. I'm an environmental historian, historical geographer, based at the University of Toronto, but I'm currently in Newfoundland on the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. My own research in various ways touches on issues of northern borders and boundaries. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about this series today.
Great. Yeah, as you mentioned, several weeks ago, you wrote an introduction to this Borders and Boundaries of the Canadian North series with Heather Green. And today I think we published our 4th installment of that series, and it's going to be continuing for several more weeks. So I thought that we would start today by kind of, not everyone is familiar with border studies or border history. So I thought maybe if you could kind of personally speak about how you define border history and studies, and then kind of talk about why when we look at northern borders, it's really unique.
Yeah, for sure. It's a hard, defining borders, of course, an extremely difficult topic or a difficult task, because borders by definition are about establishing the limits of national and territorial sovereignty. So they are very much about establishing what, or giving, in the modern sense, giving a state or a country meaning. So then to turn around and look back at the borders, as this is based on the work of Etienne Balibar, a border theorist. To look back at borders and to talk about their definition, again, is kind of an absurd project, because you're trying to establish meaning for something that is intended to give meaning. But despite the absurdity of the task, I think that we do have a substantive body of literature that is emerging and coming from areas like political geography. And again, I'm going off of your invitation to think about it personally. So I'm going to speak about a lot of the work that I guess inspires my own take on borders and boundaries. So borders and boundaries, of course, are two distinct terms. The idea of a political border often is used to describe how lines drawn on maps can be then placed on the land to define the limits of national and territorial sovereignty. But I think one of the key takeaways from some of the work in political, and I would say feminist geography, has been to think beyond the boundaries of that definition of what a political border is. So to think about conceptual boundaries as ways of marking differences between groups of humans and non-humans. Again, I come from a history of science background, so I'm interested in the way that scientists work to establish boundaries between scientific and non-scientific forms of knowledge. So that's another influence for the work that I do in this Northern Borders series. I guess another main impetus for this, and another big shift in the literature, coming, I think, out of really what political geography has done over the last 15 years or so to respond to the emergence of the borderless world discourse. This idea that through globalization we've lost the significance of boundaries has been to go back and think more about how borders and boundaries, how the marking of these lines between either nation states or different groups of people, or humans and non-humans, how the very practice of making those borders and boundaries plays a significant role in environmental relationships. So how environments, or how people and how different groups of people interact in the environment is shaped by the very making of these borders and boundaries. That's probably not totally clear, but there's a lot going on, I think, in the political and feminist geography world that is really important. There's been a lot of really good critical work that I wanted to highlight. It doesn't necessarily come out in our introduction to this series, but it's something that I want to push again. Work done by people like Harsha Walia and Rhys Jones to think about the violence of political borders. So how in our contemporary modern world, borders enact a certain kind of violence. So Harsha Walia's work on imperial borders and her recently published book, which I haven't had a chance to get to, but I'm excited to, on border and rule. I think that her project is really, it's quite important to think about the way that these are not natural lines that exist between places, but they are marked, and they're historical, social, and cultural processes that have certain implications that are not even across lines of social difference. So that's another really important piece that I want to draw out from the border studies literature. Then to move on to border history, I've said a lot about border studies at this point, so I'm just going to try to be succinct, which is not always the easiest for me when I'm talking about borders, but I do want to say, I think that border history, the idea of it, really just suggests a historical approach to understanding how borders are made and the implications of those border making processes across different lines or across different groups of human, non-human people, natures. So a key takeaway, I think, from some of the border history work has been to think about how the modern world is increasingly organized through the making and the establishment of these borders. So then to take a historical approach to understanding how these border making practices occur. Did you want to jump in at any point? Feel free to ask me to clarify if I'm...
No, this is making a lot of sense to me. And I think you're speaking to the tension that I've experienced in my own work. Whereas, for instance, with my dissertation, in many ways, and this is because this is the way our settler colonial system is structured. My dissertation was focused on the borders of Canada and the U.S., the borders of provinces and states, and the borders of parks. But at the same time, a lot of what I was writing and looking at and arguing in my dissertation was to argue that those borders are fake and they don't matter as much as we think they do, or that one of the downfalls of a lot of park historians in the past has been focusing too much within borders of parks and not looking at the peripheries. And then I really like the way that you defined border history as the history of making these borders. I think as opposed to border studies, it actually is the clearest I've ever thought about it. For instance, I just read Benjamin Hoy's history, his book that recently came out about the making of the Canada-U.S. border across indigenous lands. And that's a book about making a border, creating a border. And that really helps me personally, and probably people who are going to be watching this, think about what border history is. So, yeah.
Yeah, that book is on my to-read list, and one that I want to get to fairly quickly. Other contributions that I think are really important are to think about moving beyond the traditional conceptualization of border making agents, those people and those individuals, agencies, institutions who are responsible for or have the power to make and mark borders. So this is another contribution, I think, of border studies, the theorist of boundaries and borders, who push us to think beyond these traditional, in the terms of like a Western, post-Westphalian conceptualization of what it means to make a border or boundary. So one of the things that Heather and I need to mention, this is also emerging from a Northern Borders project that is co-convened with Glenn Eyston, who's now an independent scholar in BC. One of the things that we wanted to do was to think about how boundary crossing is tied into the making of these borders. So then again, to come back to the border studies literature, to think about who it is, who is crossing these borders, and how that is tied up with an imbricator with the establishment and the enforcement of political borders or conceptual or metaphorical boundaries.
Yeah.
You had asked about the uniqueness of the North. I could speak a bit about that because
Sure.
I think that could tie in a bit to the actual series. This is something that Glenn, Heather, and I have been talking about a lot, and it really was the impetus for the series, and which began with a virtual workshop where we were working on. We had a group of speakers who were talking about animals as boundary crossers in the North, and that can be found on the NiCHE website somewhere. But one of our concerns was that in a lot of the work that's being done, borders and boundaries are conceptualized in more southerly regions. So there's a lack of emphasis in a lot of the literature on these northern borders that Heather, Glenn, and I, and others that we knew were working on. So this isn't to deny the significance and the importance of work that that has been done in places like political geography and other areas of Canadian political history, people who've been working on northern borders. But we did think that there was an imbalance. So we wanted to place a direct emphasis on northern borders and boundaries. And that's why we invited several, we sent out an open call and received 10 or 11 responses of people who were also thinking about some of these same questions in the North specifically. So that was really exciting. But then to go to the question of what is unique, like are borders in the North unique? And whenever I think of that, I'm reminded of Julie Cruikshank's work. Have you had a chance to read Do Glaciers Listen?
I have not, but I hear about it all the time, and I really should read it.
Yeah, Julie's an amazing scholar, and she has in Do Glaciers Listen, she starts the chapter on mapping borders and boundaries with a description of, looking at a topographical map that marks the border between Alaska and the Yukon, and through the St. Elias Mountains, and thinking about it as this movement. And she describes the way that the Yukon, Alaska, and BC are kind of attached to this border at extremely strange ways. And then she describes how the addition of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, I forget the exact phrasing, but it's something like it adds an element of postmodern design. But then she goes back to say, like, but this is not something that is beyond the modern. She says you have to remember that this boundary was made by the most conventional of modern state making processes. So she reminds us that this is like inherent to the modern state, the marking of this border. So in thinking about the uniqueness, I always come back to the way that Julie Cruikshank framed this as not that northern borders are in any way unique, or the marking of these borders are in any are separate from or not part of a contemporary modern society, but they're very much wrapped up with the development of a modern world system. But what I think Heather, Glenn, and I were trying to do was to think about some of the dynamic and perhaps unique or distinct socio-environmental context that shaped the making of borders, boundaries, created the conditions within which certain groups of people, animals could transgress these borders in the North. So that's where I think we're trying to think about how and again, I'm hesitant to say unique, but how the distinct northern environment created conditions that shape the making of borders in this area, and how a focus on those conditions really, I guess, can bring into relief how borders and boundaries are made.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of plays into my next question because, when we're writing publicly like this, we may be really interested in the history, but if
Mhm.
we're going to be speaking to a broader audience, a lot of times it's the contemporary issues that really get people interested in the history, right? So I thought maybe you could talk about how the history and the historical geography of these northern borders relate to or inform us a bit about contemporary issues in these regions.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I guess that this also speaks to disciplinary perspectives and inclinations. I come from a geography program,
Mm-hmm.
and my training involved a lot of work around the edges of political ecology. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, the kind of presentist approach is I push that a bit, and
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
that's one of the. I do think that's one of the strengths of environmental history again, but that's a
same.
different conversation. That's a different conversation. But I do think you're right. Like thinking about the contemporary implications of these boundary making processes is really important. So some of the conditions I think that, as I've said already, bring into relief how borders and boundaries are made. The first one, I think, would be climate. Looking at the remaking of northern environments right now, the
Mm-hmm.
rapid remaking of northern environments through uh, global warming. And so to think about how is it that we define the North? This is something that Glenn, Heather, and I talked about a lot. And each of us have done this kind of pedagogical practice or
Mm-hmm.
pedagogical approach where we've all had students, think about the boundaries that they use to define the North. And it might be
Yeah.
something like isotherms, the gradients for temperature difference. It might be something
Mm-hmm.
like permafrost. It might be the northern edge of permafrost, the tree line. And all of these borders and boundaries are, of course, being reshaped very, very rapidly in the North. Coastal
Mm-hmm.
erosion is, of course, threatening communities throughout many coastal areas in uh, northern Alaska and into northern Canada. So climate change as a process, a socio-environmental process that's rapidly shaping not just how we think about the North, but the actual northern environment. And then to gesture to some of the work that's been done and some of the papers that have come out in the series, to think about resource conflicts and how they're tied in with northern environmental change.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Finest Dunaway's piece that just came out today on the porcupine caribou herd and the emergence of a transnational fight, really an environmental justice oriented struggle to protect caribou. Finest does a wonderful job of explaining how through a focus on one particular individual, a photographer who went north to work to ensure or to protect the caribou, and how he, through engaging with the Vantar Gwich'in people, learned that caribou was not solely a story of nature versus oil. So
Mm-hmm.
this is, of course, in relation to the porcupine caribou herds, calving grounds being in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, sitting right on atop a massive
Mm-hmm.
deposit of oil that the U.S. oil and gas industry has been trying for years to get into.
Yeah.
This photographer, of course, realized that it was in his conception was something that was more connected to human groups. So there's this, protecting the caribou was also about protecting the Gwich'in, and they work together.
Mm-hmm.
The story is, of course, incredibly complex, and Finest does an excellent job of articulating the emergence of this transnational environmental justice struggle. But then again, to think about that kind of a resource conflict, we have oil in northern Alaska, Gwich'in people spanning across this political border, a migratory caribou herd who doesn't pay any respect to
Mm-hmm.
the physical placement of the border on the land that migrates across. So all of these things coming together. So an examination of a resource conflict like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, again, brings into relief the way that borders work, operate to shape environmental relations between human groups, humans and non-human animals. And I think Finest does a wonderful job of describing that in his piece. And then again, last thing I'll say on this, just to gesture back to some of the border study stuff. we're thinking about caribou as these boundary crossing animals who are shaping how a border is enforced. Questions of jurisdiction come in because you have Canadian and American indigenous groups in Canada and the United States working to protect the caribou, but you also have politicians in Canada who are working in some ways to, I guess, ensure that environmental protection happens in the United States. So it's a wonderfully complex story about a resource conflict that brings into relief, I think, the significance of these borders and boundaries. And maybe then to go back to what you said, to think about the, you know, how did you frame it? That these borders sometimes don't matter. These animals cross it. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting tension too. That's really that needs to be teased apart. When do borders matter and when do they not matter? And what conditions shape why they do matter at times and why they don't matter at other times? So yeah, that's just some thoughts on the historical geography of the North and what a focus on that brings to the border studies world. Yeah,
no, that's. I have all these things running through my head. I'm thinking about how you know, borders are often created in the past, particularly by settler colonial governments, to kind of solve problems or to gain control. Right? It's about power and. But then these same borders then create problems in the future, right? And it's kind of like dealing with that messiness, and also, you know, Indigenous peoples just dealing with this messiness all along, right? This isn't new to them. A lot of these right. I feel like some of these border struggles settlers are just beginning to think about, particularly with climate change, whereas Indigenous peoples have been struggling with movement across these artificial borders and boundaries that were placed upon them for a very long time, right? Anyways, it's just kind of interesting.
No, totally, and that ties into another thematic thread that Glenn, Heather, and I have been interested in following and examining a bit. I'm not going to say anything else on that because I've spoken quite a bit on the historical geography of northern borders.
So I thought we'd wrap up our conversation today you talked about, well, when you put out the call for this series, and when you were talking about in the introduction, you were talking about how you asked the contributors to kind of think about how looking at the North transforms the way that environmental and humanities folks conceptualize this region and conceptualize border history, et cetera, and kind of how this Northern perspective offers new perspectives that perhaps have been overlooked or just haven't been unearthed yet. So I thought we'd just finish up today with you chatting a little bit about more what people will learn from this series and the contributions in it and what to expect.
Yeah, so we are 4 or 5 pieces in now. I think 5, including the intro that Heather and I wrote. I think as we go through this, we're going to continue to see a direct engagement with some of these themes that I've highlighted and beyond. The authors are working across a broad range of historical and geographical approaches. But I think that at the heart of it, we're going to see an emphasis on the significance of these borders, and as historians are particularly good at, an emphasis and a real engagement with the specificity of the conditions that went into the making of these borders. I mean, when you were speaking, I was thinking about just again coming back to the Gwich'in. As an indigenous group that had a border cross their traditional territory. And then this border came to shape their relations across the border with groups that were now on one side of the border versus the other. So these kind of specifics, I think, are going to be engaged with throughout the series. For those getting into the series, if you haven't read yet, I think a perfect place to start is with Isabel Gapp's work on the history of Arctic cartography.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a brilliant piece. It's a wonderfully written articulation of like the history of Arctic cartography through an engagement with a specific set of maps. It's wonderfully illustrated with cartographic materials. Isabel Gapp, she really engages with the themes of the series. She
Mm-hmm.
does this. The piece really articulates, I would say, again from a settler perspective, how the settler process of map making and cartographic practices subsumed Inuit geographies within to a broader settler colonial project, and how then that moved through empire through the production of these maps, which were then used in different ways. So I would actually start with Isabel Gapp's piece.
Awesome.
We've now had two pieces on caribou, I think signifying one, the importance of caribou in this region, but also its status as a charismatic megafauna. Two different groups of caribou. Nancy Langston's piece on woodland caribou does a really interesting job, I think, of thinking about northern borders from a non-northern place.
Yeah.
So she's talking about the establishment of the way that the enforcement of the US-Canada border interrupted migration routes and led to the decline of woodland caribou populations. And then how one of the managerial responses was the translocation of caribou from northern Saskatchewan down into the lower 48 into the United States. So for me, that was a really creative way to think about some of these themes as Heather Glenn and I have been saying and wanting to engage this idea, like moving beyond traditional ways of conceiving of northern borders or conceptualizing northern borders. Thinking about non-state actors as being involved in border making practices. And I thought that was wonderful to situate that in a place that wasn't particularly north, but then to have a northern perspective highlighted the way that certain borders are made and unmade. I've spoken already about Finus's piece, so I won't say anything else about that. But it's a great piece. I'd encourage everyone to go read it today, and also to follow we've added a link or in the footnotes to the book that this piece is based on. Finus has out. It's going to be excellent. Future posts, I think, are going. Are you there?
Yeah. You dropped out a little bit, but you're back.
Oh, okay. Future posts are going to think about questions of sovereignty. So we have a traditional or a more conventional topic in the border studies world, but through a discard studies lens. So thinking about that from a perspective that will sheds light on the way that sovereignty is negotiated in certain northern areas. There's another piece coming out. That piece on the discard studies is by Desiree Valderez. Mike Jorgensen has a really interesting piece coming out later in the series on wild smoke. So how difficult, she asked this question, how difficult is it to conceptualize environmental problems when they transcend or expand beyond the boundaries, like geographic boundaries, but also historiographic boundaries. So thinking about wild smoke as a boundary making or boundary transgressing object. All the papers, I think, really, they highlight a really eclectic and diverse set of approaches to understanding borders. And really, I'm super enthused about it because I think all of the papers really hit on what Heather and I called in the intro, the vast conceptualization of northern borders and boundaries and the dynamic socio-environmental conditions that go into making these borders and boundaries. So if readers learn anything, I hope it will be about that, as I've been saying throughout the talk, our conversation, the dynamism and the distinctness of these in socio-environmental conditions that go into the making of northern borders and boundaries.
Awesome. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it so far. As someone who doesn't know a lot about this kind of topic, I'm learning a lot, and I think I really love the way in the last, I would say, 2 years, NiCHE has really started doing more of these series that look at specific topics, but they're broad topics, right? And it's really interesting to see how all these different angles that people approach these topics. And this Northern Borders and Boundaries series is just another outstanding example of that, of all these really rich and different angles that you can approach these subjects with, and it's really awesome. And yeah,
no, I think it speaks to the. I watched the NiCHE talk, what's happening, what next in Canadian environmental history, and Sean Courage described Canadian environmental history as a kind of capacious, a big tent, with a lot of approaches. And I've heard other people describe environmental history that way, and I think that this signifies the broad range of approaches that environmental historians in Canada and abroad, outside of Canada, are employing to think about it. And I mean, this was a conversation that the three of us, Glenn, Heather, and I had, when we were doing this work around borders and boundaries, and we thought other people are too.
Yeah.
I think we need to try to organize something. And we got, it started with, I said that first piece on animals as boundary crossers, which I thought was a great virtual workshop, even though it was supposed to be in the Yukon, but that was, of course, something that we lost due to the pandemic. But it was a great virtual workshop, which led us to think again about expanding the call. And I think now our next step is to move beyond the North American arc, to begin.
Did we lose you? Oh, you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah, that would be great. Beyond North America, yeah. There's so many opportunities, so many avenues to approach this, and yeah, it's why I love this field and why I love being an editor for NiCHE. Anyways, I want to thank you for joining me today, John. We may have just lost you again. Oh well. Well, we're at the end anyways, but I want to thank you for joining me today. And this is a great conversation and a lot of